She is the president of Heurista, located right here in North Asheville. And it's a company that is really fascinating. It's dedicated to improving donor relations, enhancing donor engagement, and increasing philanthropic giving. Anne has been in the field for over 20 years and has just completed her term with the Association of Donor Relations Professionals.
Yep.
So I think y'all are in for a real treat today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anne. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is so exciting for me. I have done presentations in different areas, often present. I was in Toronto last week, but the opportunity to talk to my near neighbors doesn't come often enough, so I really appreciate you having me here. I'm going to give you a little background about Heurista because we're an unusual bunch. My background started in donor recognition. That helps. There we go. Started in donor recognition, and that was about 20 years ago, as Amanda said, in Atlanta. And as the profession of fundraising and specifically donor relations and stewardship have evolved, I came to realize that donor recognition purchases, so donor walls, plaques, even honor rolls, events, those purchases all are interconnected from the donor's point of view. That's your overall relationship with the donor. So my work started to broaden past just product, things that would hang on the wall and be permanent, and look at the overall plan for relating to your donors. So that's what I'd like to talk to you all about today. I invite questions because that's actually where I thrive, is somebody challenging me with what I have to say. So at any point if you have a question, just shout out and I'll get started. I want to be clear about a word, stewardship, because for today, I would like you to help me divide several terms, one from the other. I hear stewardship used as a general word for relating with donors in every way. Amanda was just explaining to me that on the CFRE, stewardship is defined as saying thank you to the donor. In my work, I try to divide a line for my clients where we say stewardship is the thing you do relative to a gift. So that's a whole upside down thinking. But just for today, help me think that way because it helps with my points I'd like to make. So stewardship is the things that you do in reaction to a given gift. You're going to send the acknowledgement, you're going to enter the check properly, you're going to make sure you have all the data about the donor correctly logged into your systems, you're going to keep those systems up to date. Those things show that you are a good steward towards your donor of the money that they've given to your organization. On the other hand, donor relations leads to relationships. And that's why I like to do that split in the conversation, is that some things that we do should be more proactive. They should almost tread into the area where one thinks about cultivation. So when one goes as far as donor relations going to non-donors, normally we would think we're in cultivation. But there's no reason that the things that you do for and about the donor that you have today aren't helping you build a stronger relationship, not just with that donor, but with any other donor you might wish to have. So the way we make our decisions about donor relations and stewardship should be ultimately a statement of what your organization's character is about and how your organization chooses to say thank you to your donors. Now, for those of you who have worked on donor recognition projects, that can actually be a big change in the way people think, because often, especially at major gift levels, there's the interest in pleasing the donor with donor recognition, be it an event or a plaque. It's always what would the donor most like to see. But in reality, if you are being true to your organization, that statement needs to come from who the organization is to resonate with the donor, that they've not just been placated or been catered to, but that you're actually using their gift to continue your mission and meet the goals they invested in. So staying true to who you are is a very important part of all donor recognition and donor relations. Donor retention, from my point of view, is the reason that we do this. And because donor retention rates are so low right now, a year ago they were saying that 30% of our donors would give to the same organization again in America. That's incredibly low. So the effort to try to shift that is made possible by donor relations and stewardship. Last week I was in Toronto and I was listening to a presentation from a gentleman named David Palmer, and he's leading the Boundless campaign at the University of Toronto. That is the biggest university campaign in Canadian history. And so as part of his work, he did a benchmarking case study across Canada and peer academic institutions in the United States, and found that for donors who have made a 7-figure gift, those donors have made at least, well, on average, 30 gifts in their lifetime. The median value of their first gift was $100. And they had been doing, that activity had been going on for 20.9 years. So, what that means is stewardship is an activity, donor relations, that we go into for the long haul. It's not just about a reaction that happens once a year or a reaction that happens right after the gift comes. It's a change in the way we react to our donor pool. Another thing that I picked up on last week that I really liked was the fact that we all hear the term culture of philanthropy, and I love it. I think it's beautiful. But over the last couple of years, I've come to think, well, let's hold on. Philanthropy is really about fundraising. And so I would challenge us all to change and think, what about a culture of gratitude? What would shift in the way the asks happen and the way we relate to our donors if instead we demonstrated from an authentic place our culture of gratitude first, maybe even before the gift comes, and then turn that around to attract more giving, rather than thinking that stewardship is the office down the hall or the person with the last 3 bullets on their job description. I saw some nods when I mentioned that. That's not new to you guys? Okay, good. That makes me happy. All right, so this is from our work. I typically do a survey of the institutions that we work with to try to find out what stewardship means internally. And this is actually from a donor here in the Asheville community, verbatim. She laid it just right out there. She's been well trained. She knew exactly what she was doing. When I asked her what a well-stewarded donor would do, like how could the organization gauge that they had done a good job, her answers were, the donor contributes financially at least annually. That's when I had a clue that perhaps she'd actually been trained in this. Is engaged in the mission of the organization, so volunteering, serving as a good advocate, understanding what's going on with the organization, and speaks positively about the organization and the community. Are there things that any of you would add when you think about how you know that you have a donor who is well stewarded?
One of the top 3 organizations that they contribute.
That's a good measure, very good measure.
They bring people in.
Excellent measure. Some of the scores, well, there's, as you all know, you're used to different predictive scores that'll talk about how much a donor is likely to give. There is work now towards at least conceiving of what an engagement score might look like, so that you could measure how engaged a donor is. And the metrics that are being measured there are their overall giving, which I don't necessarily agree with that being the top one, the frequency of their giving, a positive trend in their giving, their interactions with the organization. And I think the interactions with the organization are hard to measure because that assumes that they have reason to be on campus. And what we're finding is that more and more organizations don't have their donors in their facilities. They may not have facilities at all. So for those organizations, they're looking for any sign that they have had a positive connect, whether it's through social media or a mailer or another event that's held elsewhere with their donors. So it's trending towards typical marketing campaigns, rather than assuming you can only measure that they went to the mall and bought the Sony. If you can trend that they're aware of the Sony, then you know you're making a positive piece. Is there anything else that this group is measuring to know about engagement within your donor pools? Leadership? Leadership, that's a very good example. The one other piece that I'm looking for is donors who actually argue back. So where this says right down here they speak positively about the organization, I want them to speak positively to the public, like they're a good representative. But I know I've really got one on the hook if every time they can get the right person in the corner, they've got a laundry list of things they'd like to discuss. Now exactly how we learn to hear that and what we do with that information is still a little wiggly. But I really, oh, you got one?
Yeah, by that maybe we got one. We got
And at this point, is he pulling the boat or the boat still got hold of him?
one. The boat ran over me about 2 weeks ago.
Uh-oh, yeah. But you're still listening, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually
It's
a
great
gift.
fun.
Yeah, it's a gift. All right, so what I'd like to talk about from training donor relations and stewardship, there are basically 4 main keys. And I did bring a set of cards today, and it's actually a whole set, and there's plenty of here for everybody to have one. It's 36 cards that are just some tips that you might want to take back to your shop. But the most important one is to really break down what stewardship's 4 main key pieces are. The first one is acknowledgement. So for me, that falls in the stewardship part. It's a somewhat mechanical function with a really personality flair when done properly. So if you can get that receipt to touch their heartstrings in the same way that any other communication would, you're investing better in that activity. But acknowledgement is basically letting them know you've received the gift and giving them thank you. Recognition is a much bigger, broader pool. Having worked in this for 20 years, it can be everything from a handshake, an event, a lunch, a mailer, a plaque on the wall, all variety of things. And the important part for me about recognition is really breaking the word down and starting to understand what that word means. There are 2 definitions. The first one actually comes from Latin, and it's recognoscere, if my Latin or my Italian still holds true for me for a little bit. And it means to know again. You know, think of recognize, like what we mean when I recognize you in public, right? It means I actually see you, I know who you are, I know why you do what you do. The second definition is to publicly acknowledge for accomplishment. Well, when we do the majority of our work around recognition, we're focused on that second piece too heavily, I would argue. Because what the donor is wanting, and what Penelope Burke has pointed out that donors' biggest fear is that you don't understand who they are or why they made the gift. So absolutely everything you do has to be true to who that person is. That's why getting the name right is so important. I mean, every little thing can trigger that sense that you don't actually know your donor, you don't understand who they are. So if I were to give you my one, this is the thing Anne tried to contribute to the industry, is that storytelling is huge, huge. If you are telling stories for, to, and about your donors, then you're actually stroking that piece of they heard me, they heard me, they heard me. So everything that you do, whether it's the letter you write them, the phone call, needs to always give them a little of their own story back. And that includes even in the donor recognition portion, like I mean the physical stuff on the wall. So that's where my change has been focused for my career, is trying to get story worked back into the actual physical product. Reporting is another key piece. And most of my work, about 60–70% of it is with universities. And in the university model, they do very specific impact reporting. They're lovely, multiple page documents. They have, you know, endowment reporting information, beautiful pictures, beautiful stories. But impact reporting has to happen for every organization and at every gift level. And the trick is just making sure that you have a hierarchy of activity that grows with your donor's level of engagement. And I said engagement, that we're back to measuring what engagement is. Too often those reporting structures get built around gift level. So our major 5 donors are going to get personal visits, and they're going to get a special mailer, and all these things are going to happen, when in fact 1 or more of them may have started to either self-perpetuate their relationship with the organization, and so you could actually change your relationship with them and not have to go through these formal steps. Whereas your mid-tier and lower donors really need more information from you in order to grow up in that stack. So this is where there's a lot of work going on right now about developing tools that can be used for the masses. So I'd ask you, if you have a stewardship plan, to go through it and look for every activity that it would not cost you any more money to take that same information and share it with everyone else. The exclusivity upon which we built our donor recognition programs 10 years ago was actually working in the negative. It wasn't giving the top tier donor a sense of inclusiveness in the organization. It was excluding the mid-tier donors from understanding what the organizations must do in immediate response, and this is what we just accomplished. So any way that you can incorporate more information for more people, I would recommend it.
Can I stop you right there?
Yes.
One of the things about incorporating more information is that as we as fundraisers are telling our story and talking about the donors and these things you're mentioning, there are going to be people in the administration who basically think you don't want to tell them anything. Tell them as little as possible. We don't want any facts out there that's going to mess anybody up. How much of a problem do you find this in your work?
I find that it is a problem in the perception. I think that what you're saying is 100% accurate. But I think the sooner that the donor hears, we are planning to, we are considering, the more they feel that they've been trusted with information, just as when you're doing business planning and you need your local banker to understand what you're after. People need to know what the objectives are, and they just shouldn't be delivered as absolute fact. And that's where the challenge comes in. It's interesting that you should bring that up, because today I got Mission's My Health magazine, came in the mail today. And just out of sheer curiosity, I went through every page, no mention of the foundation, absolutely no mention of fundraising, no donor story at all. Now, I believe the reason that happens is because the organization used their marketing department to hire a specific service on the outside, and the specific service on the outside is pushing back against that notion. But I would say that anything that is an investment in going out to your general public should have some donor component to it, some stewardship component, because that's just better investment in the mailing itself. I mean, you're building the notion that the organization needs philanthropy, which, I mean, anyone who knows Mission would know that they do want and need philanthropy, just like the rest of us. So I think that there is the piece of, A, we need to protect ourselves against promises made to donors, but then that literally just puts up a block. And that the more that people feel that they are part of the planning process, especially higher donors, they're actually more engaged by the organization. I mean, most donors have a entrepreneurial bent, and they want to make some risks with you.
And so it's up to us to be the change agents with some of these other administrators as to the importance of this.
Yes, agreed. I heard another interesting thing, and I think it was Adrian Sargent at the conference in Baltimore, and I knew this, but it wasn't something that I had thought about in this way. He was making the point that the donor makes a relationship with the institution in order to achieve an objective. So the donor actually made the relationship with the objective first and chose the institution as the most likely one to pick to help achieve it. In all that mix, the fundraiser is at the highest risk for blame from both sides if things don't go well, because you're effectively seen as the connector, but you have no power in that. So here you are supposed to be the change agent, which I fully agree with you, that's your responsibility and that's the road to success for your role. But in the relationship between the institution and the organization, you are actually to the side of it. You're not a direct line between the goal and the donor's investment, which I think is a challenge. Have any of you experienced that in a way that, I mean, I've used the term promise keepers, like that's what we end up being, is whatever got promised, I'll make it happen, I'm just not sure. But then you run into the ethical piece. I saw some nods. Were there any specific stories around that? All right, well, I'm going to keep moving because I do have some examples in here locally that I'd like to show. So engagement is, in the end, the critical piece, but that's the fourth of the donor relations team's purposes. And as Amanda mentioned, I work with the Association of Donor Relations Professionals, and they have what they call a BHAG. I don't know if any of you have done business planning where you make a BHAG. A BHAG is a big, hairy, audacious goal, which I love that terminology. And it comes from business planning, and the notion is that what you're going to do is so big you can't believe it. It's so scary that you call it hairy just to calm yourself down. It's audacious because nobody else believes you can accomplish it, but it's a real goal. It's got dates, it's got a plan, you're going to, this is what you're going to work towards. And for the Association of Donor Relations Professionals, their big, hairy, audacious goal, which means it's a 10 to 30 year plan, is to actually move away from either the term stewardship or donor relations and focus on the term engagement, because engagement is the answer to the retention issue. All right. You mentioned how you work with folks on the inside. For me, one of the biggest pieces to making the shift towards a culture of gratitude, or a culture of philanthropy for that matter, is internal education. I think so often in our organizations, no matter their size, there are people who think it's your job to go raise money, and I'll do what I'm supposed to do with it once it's here, and it's your job to take care of that donor, and I don't really have to engage them. And it's your job to make sure all this works quietly and without messing up any of the other plans we have laid out. Have you all seen this? I see it all the time. Right now, and I wish Jess Williams was here, the YMCA a year ago started working on putting what they call philanthropy centers. So these are individual interactive kiosks in each of their branches. They include a whole wave of donor recognition behind the scenes, if you know what you're going in there for.
Melissa Penscott is here from the Y. She works for Jess.
Yes.
Hello,
I
Melissa.
have not met you yet, but I've spoken with Jess about you.
Well,
many
hello.
times.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. Oh, if I say anything off base, let me know, but I think I've got it.
I think you know what you're saying.
Thank you. So there's all sorts of donor recognition in there. So we've replaced what was the old hardscape donor recognition, which was somewhat expensive to keep up with, limited in the amount of space it could use, and the staff was completely unaware that it was even there. I mean, we did a test when we got ready to put the philanthropy centers in. We called up the Y branch and said, can you please tell me what the last name is in the lower right-hand corner of your donor recognition display? And the person answered the phone would say, where is it? And we knew for a fact it was like 12 feet in front of their face, and had been 12 feet in front of their face the whole time. So we changed to this interactive piece with two goals that the donors will never know about, so don't tell anybody. One was internal education. We are testing staff inside the YMCA branches to see how much more awareness they have of philanthropy. So we're not focusing on individual donor names, we're putting stories about philanthropy on a flashing screen, which I'm not a massive proponent of electronics, but if you've been in a Y branch, you know how busy they are. That flashing screen should be helping us. The other piece that we're working on with that is, excuse me, the ability to have more members give. The Y nationally, this is not just the Y here, Y nationally has remarkably low numbers of members who give, which is surprising because they're faith-based organization ultimately. They know their donor pool, their donor prospect pool is actually quite philanthropic, but they haven't engaged with the Y as a cause. And so from a national level down, but also especially here in our local community, there's a lot of focus on trying to make sure that membership changes. So we're actually doing a 3-year trending in membership giving to see if our philanthropy centers work. So I'll be back in 3 years and let you know how that's going. All right, so for that internal knowledge to work, guess what you are in addition to the promise keeper? You are the holder of the secrets. You are the one who met the donor. You're the one that knows why that donor gave. If you don't communicate that story, if you don't record that story, then no one else knows. No one else feels the passion to the degree that you do because you're on the front line. So being able to share that knowledge, finding internal ways, be it an internal newsletter, a monthly meeting, a routine coffee with leadership, whatever it takes to keep people engaged in what you know because you're on the front line, ultimately helps the entire stewardship spectrum. If you go back to the impact reporting and the notion of having the donor know that you recognize them, if you don't know the story, then you can't recognize it. So one of the other pieces that I'm really focused in on, and have been for the last couple of years, is how do we start to gather and record that information? And if we gather and record it, can we analyze it? So that's why Sean's my new buddy, because I think there's actually ways, just as would be happening in any other industry, to look for changes in the way that our donors react to giving in general, react to individual organizations, react to our behavior. So if we put in a new display or we start a new mailing, how does that impact our donor pool? All right, so one of the traditions that I mentioned earlier that I think is a real game changer for the industry is to rethink the tradition of a top-down model for donor engagement. Don't assume that the most engaged donor, the one who is well stewarded, gave the most. The person that gave the most gave for reasons that you had some control over, but not all the control over. And when you can invest your stewardship efforts in a wider, broader base, you actually encourage greater giving overall and the likelihood that there'll be more people in that larger pool. So one of the pieces that I ask you to think about today is how do you draw your donor pyramid? And does it even look like a pyramid? I mean, we just all refer to it, we know what we're talking about, but usually they look like crazy warped things. And so why did you pick this dollar level as the dividing point for that group of donors? Would it not be better to say we have the energy to invest in individualized stewardship plans for our top 12 donors? Who are they? And you may find out that there's a huge gap between number 12 and number 10. And starting to understand that and how you give number 10 access to number 2 and 3. And if that happens, what changes in their relationships? I think that that is part of the engagement strategy that is fairly new and is going to be hard to institutionalize, because in the last 10 years we put so much effort into drawing the complex diagrams and deciding that 25,000 was the entry for this and 100,000 would be that, and you know, major giving is at 1,000, and whatever it is in your organization, it's different, but the numbers are too rounded off. That was where I first settled on something's broken in that, because we're not looking at the donors, we're looking at a math that makes sense to us. So in order to accomplish that, you want to take an internal audit. And for us, an internal audit goes all over the place. I tell my clients jokingly that instead of handing out business cards, I'm going to give them BC powders. Because there's going to be a moment where I look over and they're sitting, holding up their heads like, gosh, that was really, really complicated. Why did we go through all that? But you want to look at everything that you're doing that might be considered stewardship. So in Mission's case, why does that publication get a mention of donors and this one doesn't? In University's case, why does this group of communication people focus only on that letter and a different group of communications people focus on the president's letter? How could the two be tied together? In a smaller organization, we only have the money to send out 3 letters this year. What's going to go in them and who signs them and when do they go? So looking at the overall spectrum of what you do and try to balance it out. Try to look for ways that there are constant touches with donors all the time. At the University of Michigan, they are doing quite a bit of internal audit and analytics pieces. Their donor prospecting team hired a new hotshot analytics guy who's already left and gone into for-profit business. But while he was there, he was able to do a big shift in the way they looked at their data. And rather than thinking that the only way to do analytics was to look forward, so like plan a blind, double-blind, good-to-go test and run it for 3 years, he said, no, let's turn around and look backwards into what we're already doing. What they're finding in their multi-billion-dollar campaign is that a donor who receives a touch, it doesn't matter what, any touch, is 7 times more likely to give, 7 times more likely to make a second gift in that campaign. So all of a sudden there's a big uptick, and this is also happening at other major universities across the country, in actual staff with donor relations in their title, because they're realizing that the activity of connecting with your donors equals more fundraising. So for most of us, we don't get a new staff person. That's where the challenge comes in. So how do we spread the activities that we're already doing and say, okay, but we need to put this donor touch in at least 5 of them this year? What can we change that actually makes it more personal, or makes it actually, you know, the donor realizes that this is about them and has that recognition component? So these are the basic tools, and this is listed in the set of cards if you guys are interested in this, that I would recommend any organization have for taking that internal audit and looking at where your stewardship practices stand. The first is an organizational chart with job descriptions. We're working with a client right now that has 3 staff people and all of their stewardship is going to take place with volunteers. It's a new trial for us, but we're really excited about it, and the donors are stepping up and wanting to be those volunteers because they want to connect with their peers. So we're pretty excited about that. You want to know what your bylaws, policies, and procedures are? I think that's an important piece that all of us know about. Your gift regulations, especially for naming opportunities. For those of you that do naming opportunities, those are the contracts that we keep hearing about in the news. You want to make sure yours are clean and clear and ready, and AFP offers some fantastic tools for making sure you're ready for that. I'm going to skip down some of these. You're going to have a matrix. The one that I think is especially important for people who are not in AFP, and I think you guys should pat yourselves on the back for the fact that you have it, is the Donor Bill of Rights. It's such a critical piece of understanding what it is that the donor will expect. And it came from a lot of work of people interviewing donors and actually coming to understand what it was a donor expected and what our ethical practice responsibilities would be back towards those donors. So
I actually
thank you
have
for that.
copies of that I can give you if anybody would be interested in seeing one, a current one.
Yeah, and I just happened to send it to somebody yesterday. If you Google it, it's on the AFP
Yeah.
website real quickly. So a little bit of the history of it is on the AFP website as well. So it's a great tool, very good tool, especially for internal education. So there's two processes that we typically go through. One is the internal program design, and that's helping an organization understand what their behaviors are going to be. And I just wanted you guys to see it. It's a matrix. You don't need to read what's up there. That's the boring way we were doing it. But I wanted to celebrate the why, because they have moved to actually putting this into their workflow process. This goes all the way down to the branch managers, because where that work to make sure that donor stewardship is integrated all the way through the organization takes place is at the branch level. That's where you're most likely to encounter a routine donor if we're in the process of upping membership giving. So I just wanted to highlight this as a way of making sure that what you're doing is not following somebody else's recipe book. You may look at their recipe book to get started, but you actually want to make it particular to your organization. Just by show of hands, how many of you actually have a stewardship plan? That's great. That's fantastic. I was surprised a couple of years ago to find out that, I think it was Charity Navigator, one of the measurement ones, was saying that you have to have a donor recognition plan in order to get their bonus points, or how, exactly how that was working. But when I did some research into it, what they had was actually their naming opportunities policy. A true donor recognition plan was not part of what they looked at. It was not like an action plan that you could work. It was a don'ts, not a do's, which I think is important. All right, then another piece, if you're moving into the physical product, is to do tangible design. And as I said, that's sort of where my expertise started. And this information, this is the Y piece that I was telling you about, heavily branded to the YMCA YUSA brand. So the typefaces that are on there, the coloration, I mean the Y, the fact that it has rounded rectangles, the Y has a super, super specific brand. But I strongly recommend doing that because if you think about it, there are donors in this community who have given to 5 of the organizations in this room. If your plaques, if your letters, if the information you send back is too boilerplate, then it starts to not matter that this plaque went up at UNCA and that plaque went up at Mission. They need to be different, they need to be branded, and they need to really represent who the organization is. How many people in this room have a physical presence where you have plaques and donor walls? Okay. And how many of those have a specific brand versus we bought this year, this one year, and this another year? Great. Fantastic. I would love to see examples. If you guys wouldn't mind maybe emailing me examples, I would love to do it, or I'll come do a tour. These are some of the slides that are in the WISE piece. So I just wanted to run through those with you. So you see the storytelling that's going on here. It's talking to the donor, like Tom Ahern would tell us. It's not about what we did, it's what you did. We worked very carefully to make sure all our storytelling was already including the donor, even though the majority of the members are not yet donors, so that they get that message that you are how this happens. We're even going as far as some specific recognition of people in our community, and that's to connect faces, which is very important within the Y. The Ys are great in that they have individual branch mayors. I mean, they do a whole series of realizing that they have repeated visitors, and how do they build on that community. This is their area naming program, and we're really looking forward to rolling this out in the next year. So it is based on a hierarchy, and the hierarchy relates to gift, as we said, but it's naming opportunities, so that's not unusual for a naming opportunities program. The piece that's different about it is that it takes some amount of storytelling down even to the smallest naming opportunity. So even at a $10,000 gift, there's going to be enough of a statement that 10 years from now, anyone that visits will know why that donor was a part of that campaign. And I think that was a major shift in the way they had been doing recognition in the past. How many of you include story in your donor plaques? Great. One of the things that I love and have embarrassed myself before, but I do love them, is I once stood up, and I'm going to do it again today, and said that, you know, architects have blinders, and they really think that they are true to what that building needs to be. And that's one of those places where sometimes there's a challenge, is stepping over what the architect thinks is going to look best in the building and pointing out that it needs to be larger or different or flexible in order to have some story included. Dimensional letters on the wall alone are not sufficient for a naming opportunity. That's, in my book, ultimately wayfinding. All right, so we talked about an engagement score. For me, a success of a donor relations program is measuring the effectiveness and predictability and cost effectiveness of that program. Just as you would with fundraising, you want to make sure that what you're doing can be repeated by others in your organization. When we talk about large institutions like universities, they then have the issue of carrying that out across multiple campuses, across different units. And so taking a look at, is what you're doing sustainable and repeatable, is a very important piece of planning your donor recognition program or your stewardship program. Brought a couple of more examples just to show you guys some work that's happening here locally. This is at Mission, and it's in the lobby near the gift shop. It was a, it is a philanthropy center of sorts, although we are hoping at some point that it will actually expand and include a history exhibit. As you can well imagine, Mission has lots of future plans about who lives where and what sits here in the lobby and what sits there. So we're stymied a little bit while they make some of those decisions in the last year or so. But this has a lower portion that's interactive, and that includes recognition of all donors from $1,000 to $99,999. And then when you hit the $100,000 mark, you're listed permanently in the list at the top. So things that are special about this, the tile work around it was designed by a local artist here in Asheville, Alex Irvine. I don't know if you're aware of him, but he just did the new piece that's down on the side of the loft. This piece is a couple of years older than that. And it uses the Mission logo, but in an algorithm that is very specific to another tile artist that used to live here. And so we were able to share pieces of that tile work with the donors in that $100,000 and above group with an artist statement. And that was something that they all really appreciated, because it was something that went a step beyond and gave them a piece of the display to take home. This is at Catawba Valley Medical Center in Hickory. And it's a full philanthropy center in that it has a history component, it has donor recognition, it has a tie-in with the marketing department. It's all flexible. The majority of the graphics are large format print, so they change out. I think these are all trends that we see in donor recognition that are making the investment far more worthwhile. I make the argument that donor recognition, if you're spending $1, 30 cents of it should be to make sure that the donor you have is well recognized. 70 cents of it should be to make sure the donor you want is aware of how much you appreciate your donors. So I often go head to head with both the architects and the marketing and communications teams about the location of Starbucks, who gets on the left, who gets on the right, who's seen first when you come in the door. Those sorts of things all matter as far as public recognition goes and the longevity of your donor recognition plan. Being able to have something that can grow and evolve over time. You guys are awfully quiet. We should do this before we eat. This is a piece that I'm particularly proud of. It's in Greenville, South Carolina. It's at a private school there. And this entire piece is a fabric. And it's a nice piece because it looks rigid, it looks permanent. It's very cost effective to update and doesn't have that same sense of being just a print on the wall. I've all long argued that for donor recognition purposes, you can tell a story with a crayon and a piece of paper well. It's not important what you buy, it's important that you have it meet your goals. So the one thing I'd like to challenge you all today is to think about what your goals are with your donor relations and stewardship program. Is it just to work backwards and respond to the gifts that you already have, or is it a piece of planning for the next gift that you hope to achieve? So I would love to field questions. As I said, that's my favorite part. Are there any questions? Yes.
How do you address a donor who really doesn't want you spending any money on recognizing them because they want their gift to be used, as much as possible for the purpose they gave it?
Well, for one thing, I mean, the most specific is there should be a budget for donor recognition that's not tied specifically to the gift. And then, as whenever possible, educate the donor about what I was saying with the 30%, 70%. Tell them it's 100%. This is 100% about using your story to encourage others to give. Even when I have a donor who's interested in being completely anonymous, I ask that we be able to communicate the story in a permanent public space, because you want to be able to acknowledge that the recognition happened, not for the benefit of that donor, but for the impact on the institution. So I'm not opposed to a donor who wants to be anonymous. I'm just opposed to letting the story disappear because the donor wanted to be anonymous. And the way to tiptoe into that is probably a PR, campaign first. Still do the media announcement if they're willing. Let them know, let the public know that the gift was made anonymously, and if there's any way that you can talk about why that choice happened.
Well, I know they say, like in Hendersonville, it's such a small community, they don't want the other nonprofits to know where they gave their money, or that they have money to give, because then they're going to come after them. I mean, I've heard this.
Who are you talking about?
So, it's...
I'm talking about when I was at the symphony.
Oh, I can understand that, and I can understand it from the donor's point of view. But if that's the case, is there a way to talk about the fact that the gift was made without necessarily using the person's name? Because in some cases, the person's name really does completely overshadow the gift. I mean, the national media sometimes jumps on gifts, and they actually disrespect the donor for having done something that was actually positive and good. So we want to protect our donors from that, but by the same token, you want the public, if you think about an institution like a hospital or a university, if you don't promote that philanthropy makes these projects possible, people start to think that it just happens magically, or that the institution carries the full burden of it. So I think it's important to tell the story, even if the donor doesn't want to use a name. The other piece that I wonder, and I ask this more out of novice, this is not my part of fundraising. Is the donor not aware that prospect research probably exposes them already?
No, they're not.
They're very hopeful that it does. They try to hide in multitudinous ways. No offense, though. I spent a lot of time going through trying to unlock PDFs that are locked, not searchable unless you do it the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
It's still an honor roll, it's still out there, it's locked, so I can't do it quickly. So I spent 4 hours going through it looking for names that I recognize.
In our community, I think most of our donors to the community foundation have no idea of the kind of information that we can find on them before they walk in the door. They don't know. They would be shocked if they knew what we can find out about them before that first visit. And I don't tell them.
I can understand why. One time I was at a meeting, and it was at the Citadel, so there were some big donors that were going to come in and be part of a panel. And we didn't realize it, but they sat down outside the meeting room most of an hour early. And so we're inside having this detailed conversation about whether or not you were using cumulative giving recognition versus consecutive giving to decide. And when they finally were introduced, they said, you know, we had no idea. And how stupid of us. We all run businesses. We all understand how this works. Why did we not understand that this level of strategy was a part of your work? So I don't think you want to offend anybody by letting them know. But I don't know that they would be offended should they realize it. I mean, I think it's sort of an aha moment, but it does make them uncomfortable, which I can understand. So with the Community Foundation, do you do any sort of public recognition of your donors, or does that pass through to the beneficiary organizations?
We do recognition of individual donors, and then the beneficiary organizations do it also.
Okay.
But if they're fund holders with us, yes, they definitely are receiving plenty of recognition and love and hugs.
But in a one-on-one private way, or
depends on who they are and what they respond to most. Even the ones that have said to us, you know, I really don't want to be recognized as the philanthropist of the year. Having a conversation with them to say, you're setting an example for other folks, would you please let us do this? Because this will help us raise money in other places and bring in more folks, and they see the light and they're embarrassed, but they still do it. And it doesn't affect their giving. They're still going to give, and they may give more, I don't know. You haven't really trended that particular piece, but even the ones that are the most private, if you can explain to them how it's going to help the overall organization or the philanthropy in general, which is what we are selling, is more philanthropy in general to benefit all and not just one charity. We find that they tend to respond to that and feel honored to be in a position that they can be the role model for other folks.
Right. And I also find that human nature is very complex. So it's your first conscious reaction to want to be private, but your sense of pride is still stroked when that public recognition happens. And I think that is proven by a story, and this is local here as well. There was a hospital that was raising money, and when their donor philanthropy center was designed, they sent an illustration of it with a letter saying your name will be listed as X and you're fall in this gift level. They sent out, let's say it's 140 or maybe it was more than that letter, and they raised over $20,000 back. Well, lo and behold, I heard about the same story at Berkeley, and they raised $1.4 million. I mean, it's just a scale of more people, and that's, you know, you could be crass and say, well, that's just somebody wanting to be with the Joneses, or my competitive business partners one list of us. Okay, that's what humans do. Like, that's not a terrible thing. You're not challenging them to give, but there was no ask in it. It was just, here's what we plan to do publicly. Do we have your name right? Do you like, you know, I mean, they didn't, it wasn't even an active engagement, but it was a touch, and it brought in more gifts. And that's now being studied actively at the University of Michigan, because that practice has been done so well there that they're seeing, is there any other factor playing into it, or is it literally just that mailing that's helping it happen? Yes?
So what if you don't have an office building or a place where anybody comes through your door? Are there any sort of transportable type of donor recognition walls? We've published our honor roll like in a local publication. WNC Parent for us. We always take out a full page ad to thank our donors. But you know, I've always been curious about other ways.
I think that's a very good approach. I think that getting in the right publication, and that one sounds perfect for you, makes perfect sense. I think online recognition is worthwhile, especially if you have a large donor pool that is not ever going to be in your buildings. That makes sense. The concern is typically, but then there's going to be a prospect researcher trying to read our PDF. But if the prospect researcher had the money, they'd drive to your institution and see the same list if you had the list on the wall. One of the things that I think works best for organizations that don't have a facility is to really up your social media game. And you're not going to publish your list on your Facebook, but what you're doing is training your donor to accept information from you in a digital format, which then means when you want to push that ad that went in the magazine to the donor so you make sure they all get it, they're more likely to see it and open your email and look at the list that you invested time in.
And so just a secondary question with that, for those places that do have a facility, do you usually have like an unveiling? Like what are the other steps and marketing steps that might go along with, okay, now you've got this wall, how do you tell people to come visit it, and how effective, I mean, do you see people coming to visit it? How do you kind of measure the impact?
For me, the key indicators are, one, if you do any type of tour, your donor recognition should be a stop on the tour. Whether you actually stand there and work with it or not, or if it's interactive, whatever it takes, make sure that people are pausing in front of it, that lots of publicity photos happen in front of it, that it's a frequently visited spot by those who know. Another piece that has been very successful in making a piece like that more dynamic is to match the graphics, as many of those graphics as can change, so like the large format piece or the digital piece, to your annual report and other information. So that if I visit you 2 or 3 times in a year, you may be changing out portions of it quarterly. And you don't have to work on that quarterly, you work on it once a year and then change the graphics so that those people, even in hospitals, we want the staff to stay engaged. And so we try to change up what the visuals look like on a frequent basis so that they're always seeing something different. As far as events go, there's typically an unveiling when the piece goes in new, and then if it includes any sort of routinely updated components, so like a new annual list or a ceremony that goes with adding cumulative donors, there'll be another smaller event as each inaugural, the new class is introduced into the donor recognition. Yes?
I'm on the board of an arts organization that, like all other organizations, is looking for ways to cut money. And one of the ideas was to go to one program a year. So you put everything in it or you do an insert. And one of the arguments was donors won't give if their name's not in there. Like if they give midway through the year and they miss the cutoff of when it's published. Do you find that to be true? And what would be a good argument against that?
What I find to be, I don't know about true is the right word, but normal, like most often seen, is more and more organizations are doing updates once a year, just for budgetary reasons, and you just announce when that is going to happen. And the donors are pretty confident that it will happen if you're consistent with it and do it in a timely fashion. And if you're having an event or other things that go with it, they're actually celebrating it. So I haven't found that the annual update is causing a huge problem or causing people not to give. It just has to be clearly communicated that your name doesn't go up there next week. I mean, I understand that because the digital world is actually causing people to think that it is possible to get your name up there next week. And even with a digital system, you don't have a full-time dedicated staff person that's their only responsibility, so it might not be next week. So it's I think setting a schedule and sticking to that schedule is the more appropriate way to go.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I'm just curious, you're working for universities. Students don't think of themselves as donors. I just got a letter from Bard College where my daughter goes, and it communicated some specific things about, well, we want to retain our best faculty, and we want to make sure that we do all our upgrades in our in our school. And I've often wondered, having been in development, we don't always think of students about what their reaction is, in terms of the culture. I think universities must have a special sort of challenge in terms of understanding that the people who go there, the people who pay the tuition, the people who are there but not there, you know what I mean? Who come and then they go. I mean, I'm just curious about.
Actually, the people that the whole reason anybody's there is the piece that, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it surprises me. And I think that you would actually find more similarities with grateful patient recognition and student recognition than you might think. Mm-hmm. I just paid a ton of money to have that service done, and yet they sent me this letter and want me to make a gift, and I'm confused. Faculty staff campaigns anywhere are a bear, because you've got people who feel like they've already put their heart and soul in it, and now you want money in addition. For the most part, the approach to those groups is to make them, and they don't necessarily use the word club, but some sort of almost internally focused, self-focused activity. So when students are still in school, the money that they're giving is usually either going to a specific project on campus, or it's going to a student benefit program, sometimes to a scholarship, but I don't find those to be as successful. Then as they move into young alumni, you graduate them to a slightly less self-centered, interaction with the organization. It's not necessarily directly benefiting me, but you've at least introduced them into your donor pool so that you can talk about them as donors. But you talked about the psychology of it.
Yeah.
I worked with a storytelling expert, and he was not familiar with our work. And I was questioning him about how we could, because in the university model, they set up a system that I don't fully agree with, where donors expect a thank you letter from the scholarship recipient. It'll be like, I gave to the Heart Program, and now you're going to get a Heart Program donor to write me a letter. Like, it's sort of a puzzling thing. So I'm talking to the storyteller about it, and he went into an extremely detailed, beautiful explanation of the power disparity in that. And that if the donors would put out a story and you would connect the students to the donor first, you would be so much more likely to get that donor story. It was like an aha for me. It was like, of course, like if I were the beneficiary of a scholarship, I would be afraid of my donor to a certain degree, like intimidated at least. So I thought that was an interesting twist, and I wondered, how that relates back to other types.
Never had a bit of a problem getting a student to write a letter to the donor. Did you?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah, most organizations have challenges.
Tell me your secret.
Seriously.
I always stood up in front of the students and talked about how these people had given through no, it had nothing to do with them. And then not only did I want a letter, but I wanted them to do gifting to their university forever.
And with our scholarship students, part of their orientation is a long talk on donors are generous and you're receiving the benefit of that. And it's important for you and for the students that will follow you that you have this relationship with this donor. It doesn't mean that you have to come see them when you come home on the weekend, but we do expect a letter to your donor, and your first payment will not go until we have a copy of that letter. But we're also, in part of their packet, is they get the story of the donor, why the donor set up this fund and the purpose of it and those kinds of things. And it's about that. It's not a whole lot.
You don't have to read a novel.
It's to put a person behind the name of that.
And I think that you're pointing out exactly what I was learning from this man, was that if the donor who has the upper hand in that relationship would put the storytelling out first, you would be all the more likely to get the storytelling back. So for those of you in other organizations, especially like social service organization, does this strike you as an unusual practice? Because I'm used to it.
I have, at the Red Cross, what has just blown me away for 3 years is the clients that we have served writing us thank you notes for what we did when their house burned down. And at first I was like, this is weird. And I thought, wait a minute, I can totally use this. So I have been just saving them. So when I do see a donor, I can say, this is what we get in return from our clients that you made possible for us. So yeah, it's never had a problem getting a thank you note. I can't tell you just the hundreds that come in every year.
Well, and I think that for me, one of the small nuanced differences in that model versus what I'm seeing in some of the academic institutions is that you're comfortable using anybody's any thank you note for any donor. Like, you want to make the connection, but it's not a direct line. In the academic world, the line is getting more and more direct.
Granted, I am with a educational facility in community college, but what we do is we do the thank you notes for our scholarship recipients. We do a banquet where the scholarship recipients actually are sitting down with their individual donors, which is incredibly effective for us. But what I've also started doing with all of our events, I don't have staff members, I don't have employees who volunteer, not volunteers at the event, it's the scholarship recipients who volunteer, which is a win-win. And then number one, the people who attend the event get to actually meet the students, which is huge for them. And also those students get to realize that donors aren't these mystical beings out there that just kind of drop money from the sky. I've had a number of students who now say, I can do that, I can give you money. I'm going to be the one in that chair, in a couple of years. And it's not huge, but it's just, for them, their psyche changes as far as what it takes to be a donor.
Right.
So for us, it's just, no, and also I don't have to search for volunteers because I just say, you're a recipient, you get to volunteer. And I end up turning volunteers away, which is a bizarre concept.
All right, well, thank you all for the questions, and I'm going to let Alex wrap us up.
Amanda had to step out, so remember next month we're going to have an ethics dialogue, and that is real life stories, stuff that you're going to need on a daily basis. And thank you very much for coming.